And welcome to a truly turned on, or should I say switched on edition of the Oddity Archive. Now, a few years back, I did an episode revolving around all the cash-ins following Elvis Presley's death, which I dubbed Elvisploitation. Well, today I've got a whole new strain of fill in the blank exploitation to cover, and that would be Carlosploitation. So, back in the fall of 1968, one of the all time great unlikely hits was released, and it was this little album called Switched on Bach. And as you could probably guess, it's a bunch of Bach pieces. But the twist is, and hence the name, is that they were performed on this newfangled thing called a Moog synthesizer, which in turn inadvertently launched its own subgenre. In 1964, Dr. Robert A. Moog introduced his namesake synthesizer at that year's AES, or Audio Engineering Society, convention in New York City. While it wasn't the first synthesizer, it was the first one to not take up a whole room and the first to be playable through a traditional keyboard and or ribbon controller, as opposed to computer punch cards. Unsurprisingly, the first customers were avant-gardists and TV commercial producers, who saw it as more of a noise box than anything else. By the end of 1967, the Moog had appeared on albums from the likes of Mort Garson, The Doors, if only to run a vocal effect, and The Monkees, but it was still mostly just used for spacey noises. In 1968, composer and electronic music tinkerer Walter, henceforth Wendy Carlos, set out to prove the musical validity of the synthesizer. In other words, make a conventionally identifiably musical record with a largely unproven new instrument. Working directly with Bob Moog, Wendy made some amazingly then unheard of suggestions, such radical suggestions as making the keyboard touch sensitive, like a piano or an organ or any number of other keyboard instruments. In addition, the original Moogs were legendarily unstable. Among other quirks, the Moog would often drift out of tune within minutes. Tellingly, Moog suggested all early users of his synth keep one of his technicians on hand while recording. But the real challenge of early synths in general was the fact that they were monophonic, as in could only produce one note at a time. It took 5 months of constant, painstaking work on an 8-track machine, no less, best there was at the time, but clear, workable renditions of 10 Bach pieces were created. In October of '68, Switched on Bach was released. Despite my best efforts, I have found no period reviews. Having said that, the conventional wisdom is that it was savaged by the critics, the main criticism being that Carlos was fixing what wasn't broken. Kind of missing the point there, which is at times belabored in the album's liner notes. Despite this, the album was embraced by progressive and freeform FM radio, as well as some TV stations and networks, usually as bumper music. Between the extra exposure and word of mouth, the album proceeded to hit number 10 on the Billboard 200 chart in April of 1969 and topped the classical album chart for an astounding 3 years. Before the 60s were out, Carlos herself managed to get a sequel out the door, and unwittingly usher in a slew of imitators and general, usually quickly and cheaply made, synthesizer albums. Having said that, these albums really ran the gamut. Some were perfectly solid jazz or classical albums, some were harsh and avant garde, and at times hilariously pretentious. Some were bland, easy listening fluff, some were relaxing soundscapes, but most were just cheesy. The Carlosploitation trend ended around 1972, but funnily enough, when Billboard stopped carrying a classical album chart at the end of 1973, Switched On Bach was still in its upper echelon. If you've got an in-service turntable at home, Switched On Bach is one of those rare thrift store staples that I actually do recommend picking up. I mean, yeah, the sounds proper are pretty dated at this point, but you really got to appreciate the sheer craftsmanship that went into this record. The performances are really good and tight, and the arrangements are still pretty creative, so if you can get past the dated synth sound, it's well worth the effort. But of course, we're not here to give the umpteenth unnecessary butt kissing to already acknowledged classic albums. This is the Oddity Archive. We're all about detritus around here. So with that, I've picked out 4 albums that I personally say qualify as Carlosploitation. And each one of these is meant to hit at least one of the major musical areas that these things went into. So with that in mind, let's finally get down to business here. Today's first album is actually the only really explicit Switched On Bach knockoff that we're covering today. Now, hopefully you're at least a little familiar with a songwriter by the name of Bacharach. Really, really famous, wrote tons of hits, but of course the first 4 letters of his last name are B-A-C-H, Bach. So, of course, Switched On Bacharach, despite the difference in pronunciation, was kinda inevitable. And indeed, Switched On Bacharach was released in 1969. Now, the following year, we were treated to a rather misbegotten sequel, and that happens to be today's first album. More Switched On Bacharach. Now, the Moog synthesizer actually doesn't factor all that much into this one. I mean, it's there, it's on all of the songs, but what we're dealing with here are a bunch of totally bland, totally straight, Muzak-y covers of Burt Bacharach tunes. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, Close to You, and some of those other ones. But instead of the, if you will, lead vocal, it's a Moog synthesizer. So it's kind of like any other Muzak album, just replace the flute or whatever that's acting as the lead vocal for a Moog. But of course, like just about every Muzak album I've ever covered, it's cute for about 2 minutes, and then you just find yourself longing for the actual hits. I think we can pretty squarely put the blame on the 60s counterculture for the pop culture rise of astrology. And given the Moog's unintentional ties to the counterculture culture, I guess it was a perfect fit for some more new agey type stuff. And indeed, in the spring of 1967, Mort Garson put out an album featuring the Moog, no less. Actually, I think it's the first album to ever feature one, first major label one anyway. But this album was called The Zodiac, Cosmic Sounds. It had 12 cuts on it, and each one corresponded to each sign of the zodiac, and featured some fairly generic rock music and little splashes of Moog here and there, topped off by spoken word vocals describing the basic traits of each sign. Now, this album just barely scraped the charts at the time, but I guess that was enough that in 1969, A&M Records was confident enough to contract Garson to expand this idea out to 12 albums. One full album for each sign of the zodiac. And this time around, the musical end of things would be filled completely by the Moog. Now, these albums were made and released later in 1969, and this series was called Signs of the Zodiac. So creative. But naturally, I had to pick out the album from this series corresponding to my sign. So, that's our next album, Scorpio. And musically, this falls very much into the relaxing soundscape end of things. And it was pretty well done, to the point where I found myself at times wishing I could shut off the spoken word stuff and just listen to the music. But of course, no such luck. But anyway, I guess it's time we learned a little more about old Benny Boy's sign. Spoiler alert, according to this album, I'm kind of a bastard. But you knew that already.
Seven is the number of victory, and Scorpio's primary need is to be victorious.
Because bloodstone is dark crystals of green within green, because it has splashes of red exploding, it is Scorpio stone. The bloodstone has the feeling of a heavy black-green sunless forest, spotted with bursts of violence.
Color Scorpio, deep red. As deep red as passion is red when it is heavy in the blood. I know you, Scorpio, by the sure power you exert on everything and everyone about you, by the strength that makes things move apparently without effort. For Scorpio is the quiet warrior who prefers the act to the word, and who burns and is consumed by the will to win. In love, Scorpio? Oh, it's none of my business. But you are, of course. And you're going to set the night on fire, among other things.
In love with a Scorpio man, my girl? What's your threshold of pain? You don't know? You're just about to find out. If Scorpio is what you want, put away your autograph book, your roller skates, and your bubble gum. You're a big girl now. The Scorpion begins with a compulsive desire to test his strength. He will try his physical prowess against every child in the neighborhood. He will have the need to try his mental apparatus in an infinite variety of ways. He'll even be tempted to see how much pain he can take, and is most certainly going to try the power of his will against all comers.
Admittedly, this next album doesn't employ a Moog at all. This next one features a competitor to the Moog called the ARP 2500, not to be confused with its much more famous successor, the ARP 2600, which was used by just about every major rock, pop, and R&B act from about 1975 to 80. The ARP 2500 sounds a lot like the Moog, the only real difference being that the 2500 was kinda notorious for all the filters and stuff to bleed into each other, coming off sounding like a slightly more dirty version of the Moog. Speaking of dirty, this is quite possibly the last episode of Archive that I would have ever had pegged for an installment of Oddity Archive After Dark. But that's exactly what we've got here. So this next album is from 1972 and is called The Sounds of Love, A2 Sensuously Synthesized. This is easily one of the worst records I've ever covered on this show. Now, admittedly, what initially drew me to this album was the cover. But it turned out that when I saw the track listing, I thought, well, there could be some potential to this one, because there's 6 cuts here, and 3 of them are of existing major classical pieces. And I thought, well, it could be really interesting to hear somebody attempt bolero on an early synthesizer. Not sure how you do it, but hey, I'm all for it. But obviously I had my expectations way too high here, because those 3 classical pieces were just existing orchestral recordings that I'm pretty sure they did not clear the rights to, just fed into the synth, and they were just sitting there fiddling around with the knobs while it played, making little whooshy sounds over it. But to make matters even worse, the 3 original tunes are touted as being avant-garde pieces, but they seem to be more like testing the equipment. I mean, it sounds like if I were to plug my stuff into the computer or whatever and just make sure things were working, as opposed to, trying to actually play anything. But just really poor synthesizer doodles. And to make it even worse, almost all the songs on here feature the sound of some woman, maybe her, who knows, doing some of the absolute least convincing erotic moaning that I have ever heard, and probably ever committed to tape. And speaking of tape, the sound is incredibly bad all around. So much so that I actually wound up getting a second copy of this thing just because I thought maybe I had a bad pressing. Nope, it just sucks. But anyway, getting back to the woman here, at various times during her obviously separately recorded erotic sessions, you can hear the air conditioning click on, you can hear cars going by outside, the tape recorder straight up malfunctions at one point, and at other times she gets way too close to the built-in microphone on this thing. It was probably just a cassette deck. It sounds like it's a very slow-speed tape, but she breathes right into it and you get that big nasty distortion. And at other times she just straight up bumps into the tape deck. I may very well be treading on sacred ground with today's last album. This one comes to us uncredited by way of synth pioneer Jean-Jacques Perry. But here's the thing. The great stereotype among these early synth albums is that they were a bunch of cutesy, simplistic, whiz-bang sound effects laden slabs of cheese. And this fits the stereotype perfectly. So, synth pioneer or not, I'm covering it, and it's what's on the box today. The album is the Happy Moog. And the release date for this one is kind of under debate. It's not listed on here anywhere. It's a Pickwick special. Pickwick was not very consistent with their catalog numbers. Discogs says that this is from '69. Perry himself, towards the end of his life, was saying he was still working on this in '70, and his biographer says it's from '71, so take your pick. But anyway, I was talking stereotypes there. That just seems to be the call of the day with this album. It's not just stereotypically early synth album cheese, but everything is a very obvious pastiche. This album is mostly outer space and ethnic pastiches. And also, I should note that this album is kind of banking on you mispronouncing Moog. For example, one of the tracks here is called In a Happy Moog, as opposed to Mood. Now, I'll give Perry this much. Towards the end of his life, he was saying that this was really meant more as a kid's record than anything else, and I'll give him that. But it doesn't make it any less maddening of a listen, though. And on that wackadoodle note, that brings us to the end of another season of the Oddity Archive. And as is customary around here, I'm gonna back off from regular archive episodes for a few weeks and work on some other stuff around here. But that does not mean there won't be new content. Actually, as we speak, Sergey is gearing up to do another installment of his Catacomb of Classics radio show. I'm hoping to have at least an installment of archive thrifting for you. The first one this year, actually. And of course, the usual Ben's junks, and I'm going to try and get in and archive riffs. And I've got, as always, a backlog of stuff to post to Archive Annex. So, again, you won't be hurting for new material here. But anyway, I guess I should start working on episode 200, shouldn't I? It's kind of looming on the horizon. Honestly, I'd rather be able to just treat it as any other day, but I just don't think I'm going to get away with that one, so there's one more thing for me to get started on. But anyway, that's it for today's archive, and oh yeah, I missed one of my projects. I am working on my own little cutesy, cheesy synth album. Here's a little appetizer.